Today, movies are a multi-billion-dollar industry and the dominant form of entertainment for a lot of people around the world. However, it wasn't always like this. At one point, films were considered a lower form of art and a novelty that wouldn't last very long. Film actors weren't respected in the same way stage actors were. The invention of film is relatively new as well, with movies as we know them today being a little over 100 years old. Before movies, popular forms of entertainment and storytelling were theater, puppetry, shadow play, and even other projection devices like the magic lantern. There also isn't just one person that can be credited with inventing movies. Instead, it was the result of decades of experimentation and innovation by various people. It all started with the invention of photography. The first known photograph dates back to 1826. Different inventions, like the zoetrope, first introduced in 1833, helped give photos the illusion of movement and was one of the earliest steps towards film. The first motion picture ever made was of a galloping horse, shot by photographer Edward Muybridge in June 1878. The work was commissioned by Leland Stanford, a businessman and former governor of California who also owned horses. Stanford was interested in seeing how horses move. He believed that when a horse galloped, there were moments when all four of its hooves were off the ground, but due to technology at the time, he was unable to prove this theory. After a few attempts, the horse in motion film eventually proved him correct. However, it showed that when a horse is airborne, all its feet are under its body, as opposed to being stretched out as previously thought. The film was made by setting up multiple cameras along the track to each capture the horse's movement, and is a series of photographs put together. Muybridge later invented the zoopraxiscope to show his work. This invention worked by having the images copied onto a rotating glass disc that when projected gave the illusion of movement, and is one of the earliest examples of a film projector. Muybridge would go on to photograph more examples of human and animal movement and would give lectures about them using his zoopraxiscope. Soon others would do similar work. Further advances in film came in 1888 when inventor George Eastman invented the Kodak camera. It was one of the earliest successful roll film hand cameras and allowed photography to be more accessible to the general public. The company used the slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." In October 1888, what is thought to be the oldest surviving film, Roundhay Garden Scene, was made by Louis de Prince. It was shot in northern England and depicts people walking around a garden area. In the late 1880s, Thomas Edison and his assistant William Dickson would begin developing what is widely regarded as the first film camera. It was called the kinetograph. The kinetoscope would also be made in order to display the films that they made. In 1891, Edison applied for a patent for both of his inventions. It is still a matter of some debate as to who was more influential in its development, however, both played a part in it. The kinetoscope worked by having strips of film quickly rotating through a light bulb and a lens which gave the illusion of movement. Viewers were able to look through a peephole to view the footage. In May of that year, a prototype of a kinetoscope was demonstrated to around 150 members of a women's club. This was one of the first examples of a film being shown to the public, though due to the kinetoscope's limitations, people would only be able to watch one at a time instead of like modern theaters. Also, the films would only be a few seconds long. The one shown to the women is now known as the Dickson Greeting and stars the inventor William Dickson. According to a news article written in the New York Sun, the surprised and pleased clubwoman saw a small pine box standing on the floor. There were some wheels and belts near the box and a workman who had them in charge. In the top of the box was a hole, perhaps an inch in diameter. As they looked through this hole, they saw a picture of a man. It was the most marvelous picture. It bowed and smiled and waved its hands and took off its hat with the most perfect naturalness and grace. Every motion was perfect. There was not a hitch or a jerk. No wonder Edison chuckled at the effect he produced with his kinetograph. It wasn't until May 1893 when the new technology was officially revealed to the public at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. The film shown was about 30 seconds long and depicted a scene involving 3 blacksmiths working. About a year later, in April 1894, the very first kinetoscope parlor opened in New York City. Soon, many others would open throughout the country. These places allowed patrons to insert coins into the kinetoscopes to view the films, which were under a minute in length. In order to produce these films, Edison and his team started a film studio. The first production facility was located in New Jersey and became known as the Black Maria. The Black Maria being slang at the time for a police wagon used to transport criminals. A few examples of some of the films made there include a 5-second video of a man sneezing, starring one of Edison's employees, Fred Ott, as well as a 22-second scene depicting a barbershop, a 20-second film showing boxing cats, and the Sioux Ghost Dance, which featured real members of the Sioux tribe performing the ghost dance. In addition to films like these, this new technology allowed people to see well-known figures and performers that they would normally have to pay a lot to see in person, such as the dancer Carmencita, the contortionist Louis Martinetti, and Buffalo Bill. The film starring Buffalo Bill has been lost. However, there are films starring members of his group which still exist, like this one starring sharpshooter Ann Oakley. Later, attempts would be made to experiment with sound. The kinetophone would eventually be developed. The first known attempt at sound was the film now known as the Dixon Experimental Sound Film, which features a man playing violin while others dance to it. More important advances in film technology came in 1895 with the invention of the cinematograph. It was invented by Auguste and Louis Lumiere and improved many of the kinetograph's flaws. For instance, the cinematograph was portable, so films would be able to be shot anywhere instead of just in a studio. It also made developing the film easier and allowed the films to be projected, meaning multiple people would be able to watch the same movie at once instead of one at a time like with the kinetoscope. On December 28, 1895, the cinematograph was revealed to the public in Paris, France. It is widely regarded as the first commercial showing of a film. However, this is not entirely true. A few months earlier, on May 20th, 1895, films were shown to paying audiences in New York City using the idoloscope, invented by the Lambda Company. When the cinematograph was revealed to the public, 10 films, all under a minute long, were shown. Many of them depicted scenes of everyday life, called actualities, like workers leaving the Lumiere factory, the Photographical Congress arrives in Lyon, and the blacksmiths. Also shown was possibly the first instance of film used to tell a fictional story, and the first comedy film known, sometimes as The Tables Turned on the Gardener or The Sprinkler Sprinkled. Following the success of the first screening, the cinematograph began to gain popularity and be shown throughout other parts of Europe and eventually the world. One famous film by the Lumiere brothers premiered in January 1896 called The Arrival of a Train at La Coya Station. It has long been said that the film terrified audiences when it was first shown, as they were afraid of this train seemingly coming right towards them. However, many historians doubt the accuracy of these claims. The Lumiere brothers would continue being involved in films until around 1905, when they left the industry, reportedly claiming that cinema was an invention without any future. Prior to this, though, further experimentation would continue to lead towards advances in technology and storytelling. Edison's production company would begin to film locations outside the studio, producing films like the 1896 actuality Herald Square, one of the first films recorded in New York City. Also from 1896 was Black Diamond Express, which shows a train approaching railroad workers. Places such as Niagara Falls and Yellowstone would also be filmed, along with news events. William McKinley's 1897 presidential inauguration was the first inauguration to be filmed. Projection soon began to overtake the kinetoscope as the popular way to view movies. Along with the cinematograph, different devices such as the theatrograph, also called the animatograph, the kinepticon, and the biograph, founded by William Dixon, who left Edison's company in 1895, were revealed around this time and used to project film. Charles Jenkins and Thomas Armat developed the phantoscope and first demonstrated it in 1895. After some disputes over who should get more credit for the invention, Armat sold it to Edison's company. It was rebranded as the Vitascope, and most of the credit went to Thomas Edison. The Vitascope was first revealed in April 1896 in New York City. However, after Edison's company developed the projecting kinetoscope, marketing for the Vitascope stopped. Around this time, some of the world's first movie theaters began to open. In summer 1896, Vitascope Hall opened in New Orleans. The 400-seat theater showed films for around 2 months and cost 10 cents admission. Another theater opened in October of that year in Buffalo, New York, known as the Edisonia Vitascope Hall. In these years, the majority of the films were simple, unedited shots, mostly depicting everyday, mundane scenes. The main attraction was the film itself, rather than what was actually being shown. This reason is why in the beginning, a lot of people thought film was a novelty that would be short-lived. However, over time, films began to become more developed, and more filmmakers entered the industry and started experimenting with new ways to use the new art form. In 1897, the Corbett-Fitzsimmons fight, which is considered to be the first feature film, was released. It was a full recording of a boxing match between James Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons, and was at the time one of the longest films made at that point, made possible due to the invention known as the Latham loop. While it lasted around 100 minutes, today the entire film is considered lost, and only parts of it remain. Narrative films that told stories began to be released as well. Some of the earliest include The Cabbage Fairy, which also was the first film directed by a woman. The original version from 1896 is lost, but there are remakes of it from 1900 and 1902. Other narrative films are the 1899 version of Cinderella, Fire, and Stop Thief, both released in 1901, directed by James Williamson, and The House of the Devil, released in 1896 and considered to be the first horror film. With the release of more films like these came new innovations with camera techniques, editing, and special effects. The 1895 movie, Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, is believed to be the first use of special effects. It specifically uses what is known as a substitution splice. As the actor is led to the execution block, there is a cut, during which the actor is replaced with the mannequin and the mannequin's head is cut off instead. One of the earliest pioneers in special effects was French filmmaker Georges Méliès, who made films like the previously mentioned House of the Devil and Cinderella. He also made some of the first films featuring adult content or partial nudity, the only surviving one being the 1897 film After the Ball, which shows a woman getting undressed. Méliès made hundreds of films over the course of his career, many of them being some of the first to develop a lot of film techniques still used today, like time-lapse photography, multiple exposures, dissolved transitions, and on-screen effects like disappearing objects. His most famous work being A Trip to the Moon from 1902. Being around 15 minutes in length, it was one of the first science fiction movies and was very successful during its time. It was also expensive at the time to make, but despite its success, Méliès did not profit that much due to other major film companies pirating the film. Some of the effects used in A Trip to the Moon are superimpositions, fades, stop motion, and film tinting. With its innovative uses of special effects and editing, it remains one of the most important and influential films in cinema history. Another one of the most significant films released during this time is Life of an American Fireman by Edwin Porter. This film is important because it is among the first to do different filming techniques like cross-cutting. Cross-cutting is often used when two events are happening at the same time and the film cuts between both of them. For example, when the firemen are rescuing the people from the house, the film cuts back and forth between what is happening outside the house and inside, showing the things that are happening simultaneously. However, there is some debate over if this is the original version. It was found that the version with the cross-cuts may have been edited at a later date, and the original release did not have them. Regardless, it remains an important milestone for film storytelling and narrative. One of Porter's next movies, The Great Train Robbery, was released in December 1903. This one was around 10 minutes long and followed a group of bandits robbing a train. They first break into the telegraph office and force the operator to stop the train, then tie him up. Next, they get on the train, fight some of the workers, and begin to rob the train. They also force the passengers off and take some of their belongings, then escape into the woods. Meanwhile, the telegraph operator escapes and goes into a dance hall where he tells them of the robbery. They form a group and chase down the robbers. The last shot is of one of the outlaws pointing his gun at the camera and shooting directly at it. The film used a variety of editing techniques like cross-cutting, going between the bandits and the telegraph operator that was tied up, and panning shots that followed the characters instead of having the camera remain stationary like most films at the time. It was a big success and has inspired many films since. As films began to gain more popularity, in 1905, the first Nickelodeon opened. The name comes from the price of admission, 5 cents or a nickel, and the Greek word for theater, Odeon. These allowed for more people to view movies as they weren't expensive and were common in many areas. Most Nickelodeons were short-lived. As films started to become longer, larger, more advanced movie theaters began to become more common. Thomas Edison began to start enforcing a number of patents he had on various types of equipment and other aspects of the film industry. In 1908, Edison and many of the major U.S. film companies came together to form the Motion Pictures Patents Company, also known as the Edison Trust. Some companies that were included in it were Biograph and Eastman Kodak. Its purpose was to effectively control the distribution, exhibition, and production of films, and was in many ways a monopoly, preventing non-licensed independent filmmakers from entering the industry by blocking access to the equipment and raw stock film, along with limiting theaters from showing their films. They also wouldn't allow actors to be credited. It became difficult for filmmakers on the East Coast to continue working without dealing with lawsuits or possibly having their equipment confiscated. Many began to look to get as far away from Thomas Edison as they could. They eventually moved to Hollywood, California. In addition to it being far from Edison's company in New Jersey, it also had year-round good weather and diverse landscapes, all of which was ideal for filming. The first film shot there was In Old California by D.W. Griffith in 1910. Nestor Studios, the first film studio in Hollywood, was opened in 1911 by David Horsley. Others would soon follow. Film producer Carl Laemmle is credited with creating the first movie stars by allowing actors to be credited for their roles. Among the first was Florence Lawrence, who was known as the Biograph Girl after the film company before her real name was publicized. Soon, Laemmle and others would begin using the movie stars to market the film. The movie stars began to develop fan bases and started to get paid more. The Motion Pictures Patents Company didn't last long and was gone around 1918. Before that, most of the American films made were short, being only 1 to 2 reels long, lasting only 10 to 20 minutes. Theaters would play multiple films in showings that would last over an hour. Demand for longer, more full-length films, known as feature films, gradually began to increase. Some of the earliest feature films came from outside the United States, like the 4-reel 1912 French film Queen Elizabeth. What is considered the first narrative feature film is The Story of the Kelly Gang, released in Australia in 1906. Some of the first longer films in America were released in separate parts, playing 1 reel each night as opposed to playing the entire film at once. This was done partially due to the MPPC's restrictions and those in charge believing that audiences wouldn't watch anything that was too long. However, it didn't take long for longer movies to become successful. Italy's first feature film, Dante's Inferno, was one of the first shown in its entirety in the United States and was highly profitable, leading many theaters to realize that they could charge more due to the longer length. Some of the first American feature films include Cleopatra and From the Manger to the Cross, both released in 1912, and the 1914 film The Merchant of Venice. Despite the rise in popularity of full-length films, some films continue to be shown in an episodic format over the course of an extended period of time, known as serials. Some of the most popular serials at the time were What Happened to Mary and The Perils of Pauline. With the start of World War I, most European film industries were negatively impacted, and the majority of film production shifted more towards Los Angeles. One of the most important filmmakers during this time was D.W. Griffith. Film critic James Agee said this about him when he died in 1948. He achieved what no other known man has achieved. To watch his work is like being witness to the beginning of melody or the first conscious use of the lever or the wheel, the emergence, coordination, and first eloquence of language, the birth of an art. and to realize that is all the work of one man. Some of Griffith's most important films include Judith of Bethulia and The Avenging Conscience, both from 1914. In 1915, the first big-budget Hollywood movie and Griffith's most influential film, Birth of a Nation, was released. At the time, it was one of the most expensive and longest films ever made, being around 3 hours in length. It is often wrongly said that The Birth of a Nation was the first feature film. However, this is incorrect. There were plenty of other features released in the years before, as previously mentioned. This was, however, a very important film, pioneering many new filmmaking and storytelling techniques still used in movies today, like close-up shots, flashbacks, film tinting, and night photography. While it may not have been the very first to do some of these things, it was perhaps the most influential. According to film critic Roger Ebert, he did not create the language of cinema so much as codify and demonstrate it, so that after him it became conventional for directors to tell a scene by cutting between wide or establishing shots and various medium shots, close-ups, and inserts of details. The first close-up must have come as an alarming surprise for its audiences. Griffith made them and other kinds of shots indispensable for telling a story. Despite this, the movie is extremely racist and portrays the Confederacy and Ku Klux Klan as heroes. While the film was controversial even during its time, inspiring protests and censorship, it was still a box office success. In some areas, tickets cost $2, which was very expensive for a movie at that time. It became the first film shown at the White House when a screening of it was held for President Woodrow Wilson. The Birth of a Nation is responsible for an increase in real-world violence and the revival of the KKK that had been inactive since the 1870s. Regardless of its subject matter, its influence in cinema cannot be ignored. Critic Sergio Alejandro Mims wrote in his review of it, "We are hopefully in an age where Birth of a Nation can be discussed, analyzed, and yes, even appreciated for its technical filmmaking and storytelling advances, that is, but it also needs to be understood that this film indelibly hurt this country with ugly consequences that we are still grappling with to this day." From this point, feature films continued to be released and movies began to have more of an impact on popular culture. More major studios opened, and the film industry gradually began to develop into what it is now. Many of these studios are still around today. With this, more movie stars rose to fame, and the public started to take interest not only in their films, but also in their private lives. The most famous from this era was Charlie Chaplin, who was well known for his comedy films. Along with the increased popularity of films came calls for censorship. Numerous scandals involving famous Hollywood actors contributed to this. For instance, actor Roscoe, or Fatty Arbuckle, was accused of raping actress Virginia Ropp. While he was later acquitted, the scandal created controversy not only around him but the entire industry. There were also films being released that some argued were immoral. With growing support for censorship, Hollywood chose to regulate themselves and brought in Presbyterian elder and politician William Hayes. Hayes introduced guidelines the studios should follow so the films would be less controversial and would comply with the moral standards of the time. By the end of the 1920s, the code was, for the most part, in full effect, and the majority of films released had to comply with it. Some of the highest-grossing films of the 1920s were The Kid, The Big Parade, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. These were all silent films. Though the films were never actually viewed in complete silence, they would often be accompanied by music and occasionally live narration. Whatever dialogue took place in the movie would be shown on title cards for the audience to read. This was because the technology to synchronize the sound with the film did not exist yet. Despite people experimenting with sound since the beginning of film, it took decades for it to finally work. This all changed on October 6, 1927, when Warner Bros. Studios released The Jazz Singer, directed by Alan Crosland and starring Al Jolson. It was the first full-length film with synchronized dialogue. The audience reportedly became hysterical upon hearing the characters talking for the first time.
I'll kiss my boy. Dirty hands, dirty face, little devil, that's what they say. But to me, he's an angel of a joy. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing. You want to hear Toot Toot Tootsie? All right. Hold on. Lou, listen. Play Toot Toot Tootsie. 3 choruses, you understand? In the 3rd chorus, I whistle. Now give it to him hard and heavy. Go right ahead. Toot Toot Tootsie. Goodbye. Toot Toot Tootsie. Don't cry.
From this point on, films which featured synchronized dialogue were called talkies. Some thought talkies were a novelty that would soon fade away, but it didn't take long for people to realize that silent films would actually be the ones to go. However, this change happened gradually as the industry took time to adjust to sound. The transition into sound wouldn't be good for everyone in Hollywood though. Many actors that thrived in silent movies had trouble with sound. In some cases, the actor's voice didn't match what most people thought they'd sound like. One example of this is Carl Dane, who was a big star in the silent era, but as sound became more popular, he was not cast in roles as much, largely due to his thick Danish accent, which made his English hard to understand. Talkies were also made in a completely different way than silent films. Directors would no longer be able to shout instructions while filming, and it required a different style of acting. Actors would have to speak instead of using exaggerated movements and facial expressions. Actress Clara Bow is reported to have said, "I hate talkies. They're stiff and limiting. You lose a lot of your cuteness because there's no chance for action." By the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s, Hollywood would successfully transition into talking films, bringing in a new era of film, with new directors, movie stars, and movies continuing to be made. Now, obviously, movies still had a long way to go until they began to resemble the industry today, but this video was mainly just on film's early years, so the rest of film's history will not be covered in this video. Maybe I'll make another video on the subject soon though. Until then, thank you guys for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out some of the other videos on my channel as well. This has been the Friendly Neighborhood Pig, signing off.